Welcome to this edition of the Housing Ombudsman Service podcast. I'm Victoria King, one of the sector learning and development leads here at the Housing Ombudsman Service, and today I'm joined by Jenny Spoor, Director of Operations at the Havebury Housing Partnership. Jenny, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Havebury?
Thanks, Victoria. So we're based in the east of England with around 7,500 homes, mainly general needs, but we have some shared owners and supported housing, as well as a homeless hostel, and we develop around 210 new homes a year. I've been here 4 years, and as Director of Operations, I've got all of the landlord functions essentially. So all the housing management areas, repairs and asset management, and I also have communications and sustainability.
Thanks, Jenny. So we're here today to talk about Havebury's approach to repairs and to vulnerabilities as well. What does good service look like to residents? And is good service your main indicator of success in terms of repairs?
One of a few, I would say. Satisfaction with the service is, of course, a key one. And we've brought some key services in-house, which we know residents wanted from when we consulted on our asset management strategy a couple of years ago. But the repairs policy change was the start of a much wider piece of work we did in how we view and manage vulnerability across all service areas.
So it's about 2 years ago that you reviewed your repairs policy. What prompted that change?
Well, it was due to be renewed in line with its 3 yearly cycle. But one of the frustrations we knew about was how we defined vulnerability in this policy specifically. It was fairly standard in the previous one. So, for example, older residents or those with known disabilities. But in having this definition, it meant that we were automatically excluding anybody who didn't quite fit into what we defined in that policy.
And you touched on there some of the reasons for that change, but could you tell us a bit more about what your repairs policy covers and what changed from that original policy?
Yeah, of course. So there was a few key changes. So one of the other ones was also around being much clearer around ours and our residents' responsibilities, which wasn't particularly clear in the existing one, alongside the vulnerability change. But as I mentioned earlier, we removed the generalisation of vulnerability. And instead, we empowered our teams to have discretion on prioritising repairs. So, bringing completion of these forward, for example, or waiving recharges. So, we take a case by case approach based on the resident's individual need, and we don't just apply a blanket policy definition. We also had a number of smaller policies. So, for example, fencing, recharges, as well as our repairs one. So, we combined all of those together and made one much shorter policy where it was really clear around our responsibilities, residents' responsibilities. And it was much simpler and made for quick and easy reading, which we know was another frustration with both our residents and our teams, actually.
So each case is going to be different. So having that flexibility to consider the wider context of specific cases is really important, isn't it?
Mhm.
And having that case by case approach as well, and looking at those individual needs and circumstances of each resident, of each case, is important in allocating those resources efficiently, getting the issues addressed quickly and effectively, and doing it right first time where possible. And also circumstances can change and evolve, so you can adjust the response sort of accordingly. So back to talking about the policy now. Could you tell us the steps you took to redesign the policy, and did you include residents in that process?
Yes, we did. And we consulted and we had around 750 responses from residents, so about 10%, of our resident base. But we also listened to our teams in that they too were frustrated. They didn't always feel empowered to deal with a particular situation in front of them. So this played a part also. But other feedback from residents alongside that was around more flexibility around appointments, but also providing feedback to technicians straight after the job had been completed, and calling, not texting, when they're on the way to do a repair. So some of that was a bit of a surprise to us actually, which just, of course you need to consult with residents. Don't assume you know what residents want. So that was really important. And other things, residents want from a repair service is, as you'd expect, right first time where we can, people turning up when we say we will, and good communication. So the basics of what you'd expect in that regard.
In our Spotlight on Knowledge and Information Management report, we recommend having an automated appointment reminder system for repairs. And lots of residents we've spoken to during the research for that report, but also subsequently, really like having those reminders. And it's really interesting, actually, that you mentioned calling, not texting, being prepared by your residents. It really does show that you know your residents, their preferences, rather than just going with a system like text messages that might work for other sort of similar landlords, but you've taken that care to make sure that the communication you have with your residents works for them rather than just doing something that generally works for other landlords. So switching back then to something we touched on in an earlier point, you mentioned that you used to define vulnerabilities in your repairs policy in terms of age and demographics. Could you tell us more about what prompted the move away from that?
Because it was too binary and too tick box really, and like I said, it wasn't really working for us or for some of our residents, and it prevented the team from making the right decision at that point in time, which was a real source of frustration for our advisors also. Now our teams are curious and they care, and I'll perhaps talk about this a little bit later. But we were finding it was quite a dated approach, and it also relied on us having the absolute accurate data on a resident, which we don't always have at that point in time because vulnerabilities can ebb and flow. But not having the data, I don't think, isn't a reason to not be able to or want to tailor our services with what we have at that point in time. And speaking to a resident there and then, whether that's on on the phone or out in our communities, if there's something there that we can deal with, we just need to deal with it and not be, slightly hamstrung, I guess, by quite a binary definition in a policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really difficult to define as well, like the range of nuances of what vulnerability is. And even vulnerability in itself is the imperfect term. It makes it really hard to make that one size fits all definition. Um, so you changed your repairs policy. Did you also change your definition of vulnerabilities in your other policies as well then?
Well, it is. I mean, it's more of a principle, I guess, that we've adapted across all policies now. So we don't have a definition because, like you've just said, it's so nuanced and it can ebb and flow. But we recently launched our attitudes, rights, and respect strategy, which underpins all of what we do in this area. So, we've both said, I guess, vulnerabilities are not static. There might be a one-off event, for example, that really, prompts, an event of poor mental health in a resident that they may need some support with. Or it might be a longer term need. So, for example, we've got some complex cases where there's years of hoarding, I'm working with them, which will take years in some cases. But this strategy sets out how we will tailor service to a resident's individual need. But to support our teams, we've published some guidance and principles because we found we needed that, to support our teams when they're out and about and on the field, and they've been really well received.
And as we mentioned already, vulnerabilities can change over time, and what might impact one resident might not affect another in the same way. So it's great that you've got those principles, that guidance there to support your teams in what could be complex cases, alongside having that strategy as well. Because you can have the most amazing strategy in the world, but if it's not workable or your teams don't know how to use it, there's not much point in having it. So it's great that you've got that support there as well. So, how's the new repairs policy working in practice? Have you seen an increase in the number of repair requests you get as a result of that new policy?
Not because of this, no. And that was one of the concerns, actually, it's probably fair to say, before we launched this. But we're a couple of years in now, and no, we haven't because of the policy. We've seen an increase in repairs overall, as is the case with the rest of the sector, but it isn't because of the definition we changed around vulnerability. But what it did allow us to do is be able to respond in different ways, which helped build trust. So it's starting from a really good point, which has made gaining access and completing some repairs easier. So less time spent in some cases around trying to gain access to do repairs. But no, we haven't seen an overall increase because of this policy change.
And you touched on gaining access there, which is something that comes up a lot when we're talking to landlords and repair operatives as well. And it's interesting that you said there that changing your approach is actually helping to gain access. I know some landlords that we've spoken to have tried different things. So they've done like an analysis on the missed appointments, and they've looked at potentially, you know, if there are appointments that are being missed sort of 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, you know, offering appointments later on in the day or on weekends is proving less wasteful in those missed appointments. So in your approach, you look at what the right thing to do is, rather than just having a binary, this is the policy, this is outside the policy. Have you got any examples on what you mean by this, and how it sort of works in practice?
Yeah, so a repairs advisor might take a call from a resident who may appear distressed, or something's not quite right, you know, in terms of that call. And previously, if they didn't fit into what we had as a category, we might not have undertaken a repair or made it more of a priority, for example. But now we've empowered the advisors to do what they think is right in that situation. And for many of these, it might also include a referral into our supported team, you know, to do some further work. But what this does is helps build trust with the resident, and it's starting from a really good point. So rather than saying, no, we won't do this repair, we'll say we will, and, you know, perhaps we'll also, you know, do this, you know, X, Y, and Z, whatever that might be, which has been a gateway into working with them. But our something's not right process is also well embedded. And this is where anybody, so a member of the team, a contractor, or another agency, can visit or speak to a resident, and they can just refer into our team. So there might be evidence of something that's, you know, that perhaps a home, you know, significant mold in a home, for example, or it might just be a feeling, hence the name, something's not right. But this is a really simple email into the team. So it's an easy process. Anybody can do it. It isn't a complicated, you know, process on our housing management system. And there's a team there who will investigate and deal with any issues that are identified that way. So because it's easy to use for everybody and it works, it's really powerful and beneficial. You know, we have referrals from, you know, technicians who are out and about in our homes day in, day out, to other agencies. And because, you know, we don't have, you know, there is no definition of vulnerability, or, you know, indeed, we don't need evidence. We've picked up some, you know, quite significant issues that way that perhaps, you know, we may not have done in any other ways. And that's been hugely successful for us.
We've had some of your staff members on our virtual workshops as well, and they've told us about this. And they say
Mm.
it might not be something specific, but that gut feeling that something, like you said there, something's not right,
Mm.
and reporting that, and then doing a bit further investigation. We had such wonderful interaction from your staff on our virtual workshops, Jenny. So thank you
Oh,
to
that's
them.
good to hear. Thank you.
And it's I'm glad to hear it's working in practice as well. So what changes did you make within the organization to empower staff to be able to make those judgments around the right thing to do?
So we started, I mean, you know, in truth, this work will never be done, you know, because things shift and change. But some significant pieces of work we did. Last year, so in 2024, we rolled out customer service training across the whole business. But we also use Huddle, so our repairs team Huddle, to support and train the team so they can receive practical advice and support and talk through case studies and examples. And our supported and safeguarding teams also regularly provide training and support for any frontline team also. But we also use our complaints lessons learned, for example, you know, to use how teams could adjust their responses and service. And we give some really clear examples across all of these. So to make it more practicable, you know, real life to our teams. But a couple of other things we've done. So we enhance the information we collect on our residents moving into our homes. So we'll schedule settling in visits for a defined period. So, for example, if this is somebody's first tenancy, or there's some clear, you know, support issues there, you know, whatever they may look like, that resident might be supported by a member of the supported team in the first instance, and we'll do that visit much sooner than somebody who's perhaps held a tenancy previously, you know, and they just don't need, you know, at the same level or indeed any support. You know, we'll support our teams to do that and to make those judgments at that point, you know, whenever they come into contact with the resident. But for repairs specifically, we made some changes towards the end of last year. And the management team are now visible and on site in our communities most of the day to support frontline technicians. So what this has done is pushed decision making back into the field and gives the resident, where possible, an immediate answer. So, for example, increasing the scope of repairs works to perhaps capital changes like kitchen replacements when these are required, or where we need to decant residents whilst we undertake disruptive repairs. So this will continue to evolve. And I think the key thing with this is that, we can't, sometimes we might do something that, that perhaps, we shouldn't, perhaps we don't make the right decision, whatever that looks like, but that doesn't matter. As people, all over, we're rather complex. And that this was one concern around when we took out definition of vulnerability. But, as I've said before, we as you've said, I guess, in the sessions you've had, our teams really care. They're curious, they want to make the right decision. And that has to be the starting point, from all of this. But this will never stop. There'll always be cases, there'll always be areas we can learn, and this will be a continuous thing for us. And then finally, we rolled out one common goal, which is a commitment from our technicians, and they designed this with us and our residents. And this sets out what our technicians, managers and residents will do to ensure the job gets done to a high standard at first time fix where possible. So, for example, we'll call on route, as I've said, which was by far the highest communication preference from the consultation we did. And where follow-on works are required, the technician will be really clear with the resident around what's needed and when that job will be done. So whilst there might be more works needed, the communication is really clear and really good, and the resident knows exactly what will happen next.
Thanks, Jenny. So notice that you said there you design the technicians' commitments with the residents. We touched on this earlier. It's so important that landlords are working with residents on things like this, as it really does help create that more inclusive policies, for example, that are really reflective of the residents' needs. And it might be that you've thought of everything within the organisation, but by having a resident's perspective, they might pick up something that you've not thought of. And it also helps with that building trust and makes the organisation more transparent, which of course then creates a more cooperative and supportive environment as well. So thinking about that in the context of repairs then, and being transparent, having that good communication, when it comes to timescales for repairs with residents, it's not always the length of time that's the issue, but it's knowing when the repair is going to happen, when it's going to take place. How do you guys at Havebury ensure good communication with residents with respect to repairs?
So initially, when a repair is logged, our scheduling team will make contact with the resident and ensure they know when the repair will take place. If it doesn't suit a resident, so for example, school times, we'll know that. And then we'll adjust the repair accordingly. But sometimes for different reasons, repairs will take longer than we, our resident, will like. So for example, there might be issues with some materials, for example. But satisfaction with our repair service remains fairly high, which I think in part is because of the fact our residents know when these repairs will take place and there's good communication with regards to this. So even though, some may take longer than we and residents would like, they know when it will happen. And that's half the battle won, I think, in many cases. I think it's the absence and poor communication that can often create dissatisfaction with the repairs service. We also have text reminders, and we're able to offer a range of appointment times to ensure we are offering the best appointment for the resident, alongside the one common goal commitments I outlined earlier. And there is technology out there now, to really support, contact with residents in that way, and we are exploring that. Because there might be something there that that suits us and some residents, and we won't ever be digital by default in any stretch, but there might be more we can do in this area, and using technology to support us in doing that.
I was talking to a resident on a TPAS speaking event that I was doing about the text message reminders, and they said, "Oh, we get text messages from our landlord about repairs, but the trouble is with our text messages, they've got a job number on, and I've got loads of jobs raised with them, so I don't know which job it's in relation to." So, I just think sometimes there just needs to be that the danger of using or like automated systems and AI is that you've got to make sure that that messaging is right.
Absolutely, and it makes sense. That's the thing, like you said, if you'd find anything, getting a job number for anything, just makes no sense. Like you say, if there's multiple repairs, yeah, simple's always best.
Yeah, definitely. And we've spoken to some landlords who've now got these like book your own appointment systems where residents can actually go on, they can select the type of repair needed. It opens up the calendar of the person who can undertake that repair and the amount of time that it will take. And that landlord told us that they found this was helping with cutting down on the number of missed appointments, which, as mentioned earlier, is a point of contention for a lot of landlords. And obviously, you've got to think about, that service, it might not be accessible to all residents because, not all residents have access to the internet or the skills to be able to navigate that sort of type of system. So something like you've talked about there, just a simple call when the technician's on the way, it just shows it doesn't have to be anything too complex. It's just doing what's right for your residents and their
Mm,
needs.
yes.
Uh, so, what has the impact been on the relationships with residents as a result of making the changes to the communication around repairs and those policy changes as well?
For some, I mean, it's certainly helped build further trust, with the resident. As I outlined earlier, starting from a better place rather than saying, no, we won't do a repair. Actually, we will. So that automatically helps build, a great relationship at that point. And then, as I said, if an advisor has concerns about a resident, they'll refer them into the supported team. So we have a much greater chance of reaching positive outcomes by undertaking a repair, or indeed, something like a gas safety check or an electrical check. Where we get pushback sometimes, or we really struggle to gain access or engage with the resident because there might be significant hoarding, for example. But by having, a dual approach sometimes, it starts the relationship from a better place and from a point of trust, which has been really positive for us. And we've had, quite a number of successful outcomes, as I say, particularly around, some health and safety checks where we absolutely have to get these done. And rather than forcing something through a no access route through legal channels, which sometimes we do have to do, but for many cases, we can work with the resident, get some of the hoarding cleared, for example, so the electrical check can be done. Then we'll work with them on a longer term basis to help, to help improve, their living environment ultimately.
Yeah, you mentioned the supported team. You mentioned them earlier on as well. They're the team that look after your support fund, aren't they? And they
Mm.
offer help to residents who need support for like sustaining tenancies, like hoarding, as you mentioned there, financial inclusion. Um, Quite a few landlords we've spoken to now have similar sort of support teams in place, and these are actually really making a difference to residents' lives. So I think the Longley Foundation is one organisation that sort of works with housing associations to improve the well-being of social residents. So we know a lot of landlords are going down sort of that route. But going back now to your repairs policy again, when an organisation produces a policy, it's really important to see whether it's achieving its intended outcome. How are you at Havebury measuring whether that the policy change in your organisation has been a success?
I don't think we can measure this in terms of one thing. I mean, as I've mentioned, the repairs element is one part of this, but we do our tenant satisfaction measures, our TSMs every month. The comments, partly because we want as much as we can real-time information, and the comments are just as important as the results in that regard. But we've got transactional surveys and other indicators. So it's really difficult to measure, so there's repair satisfaction, overall satisfaction, I think, as well, because repairs is a key area for this sector. But also just as important are the individual cases that we see and read about, so for a particular resident or family, for example, where together we've been able to achieve really important outcomes and life-changing actually in some instances. And these are as important, I think, as the overall measures. They might not be showing a material change in a KPI, for example, but just seeing a difference to an individual, family or resident is just as important to me as some of the bigger stuff.
Yeah, brilliant. That yeah, looking at individuals and seeing the change in their circumstances in their lives, definitely. Yeah, really, that must be really satisfying.
So I like to get out and about with frontline teams, and particularly technicians and some people in the supported team, for example. And through that, I see some changes with some residents, particularly a hoarding case, for example, where an advisor's worked with the resident for a really long time, and to see the difference, over the case, of a couple of years in some instances, is brilliant. And that's really important to me because I can read a report, I can look at KPIs, and think great, but actually seeing it and seeing the difference to residents is part of one of the most satisfying parts of my job, I think.
You've sort of touched on my next question here already. You've got that advisor in that hoarding case there, where they've worked with that resident for a really long time. Having good staff with the right skills is really important, isn't it? And we know that high staff turnover is a real problem for some landlords. How do you manage this at Havebury?
Yeah, I mean, our turnover isn't as such that we have that in all teams, but of course, we're not immune to this. But in some teams, so our repairs advisors, for example, people generally move internally, so skills and experience aren't lost. And our induction is as much about learning our culture and approach as it is our processes. And that's not unique, I don't think, but it really is somewhere special to work here. And all of our new starters say this to us, through the induction process. That's really important. But we've made a number of changes. We've increased the number of technicians in our DLOs. We've brought more services in-house. But we've also had an increase in demand, so our increase in technicians reflects that. But we also review each vacancy we get within teams. So, for example, we had a vacancy in our income team. But we use this as an opportunity to add another post into our supported team as the need and demand warranted this. But we're a certified great place to work, and staff satisfaction is good. And we see this through the great services being delivered. And one common theme we get from residents is how helpful and friendly our teams are, almost without exception. And this is through TSMs, transactional surveys, at community events, and some residents, come out just to meet us. Rather than raise issues. So, we see people being satisfied here, being delivered through great services. Happy teams, happy customers, I think the saying is, but we definitely see that.
Yeah, and I mentioned this earlier, we've had some of your staff on our virtual workshops, and on our virtual workshops, there are some people who are really quiet, they don't say anything. Not with your staff. They were there sharing examples, they seem really happy. So it does shine through, and great representation of Havebury as well. So you mentioned DLO there. So if you're quite new to housing, just to clarify, that's direct labour organisation. So if those listening want to have a quick internet search, if you don't know what that is, I won't go into it here because it can get quite in depth. So yeah, do your Googling. So we're drawing towards the end of the podcast now, and I've got one final question for you, Jenny. We might have some landlords listening who are looking to upgrade their repairs policy or perhaps change their approach to repairs. What advice would you give those landlords?
I mean, back to basics and simple is always best. I mean, something I tend to say quite a bit, and I think I said it earlier actually. I mean, I've worked in housing, a long time, like 27 years, I think. And I think there's sometimes a tendency to overcomplicate things. And I just think we don't always need to do that. Generally we employ really great people, so it's about freeing them up to make the best decisions they can. And of course, listening to what your residents are telling you and see things from their perspective, not what you might think, as I outlined earlier. Some of our resident consultation has led to some really surprising responses, actually. So honestly, there is nothing groundbreaking. I just think back to basics and simple is always the best way.
So thank you so much for your time today, Jenny, and thank you to those who've listened to this podcast. So you can find out more about Havebury Housing Partnership via their website, which is www.havebury.com, and you can find out more about our podcast and our resources here from the Housing Ombudsman Service on our website, www.housing-ombudsman.org.uk. Thanks, Jenny, and thank you to those who are listening. I'll see you again soon. Bye.